I'm across the street.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've got in my apartment block, for some reason, the whole internet, everything went down. Probably about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Then it came back on. Then I was rapidly trying to phone friends and say, I need to try and tether to my mobile or see if I can come up with another set or come around to someone's house or do something else. How you doing, Menno?
How are you doing?
Yeah, good. So you're in Brazil. Bill's obviously in Florida. And I'm here in the pouring rain in the middle of England. What a joy. What a joy.
I have pouring rain in the middle of Brazil. So.
Yeah, but if I'm going to be in the rain, Menno, I'd rather be in the rain, right?
I'm going to adjust my seat just because I don't like that light behind me. So let me check. Menno, I was just telling Danny, I'm across the street. My house, my internet's very spotty, so I'm at my my in-law, my wife's parents' house. They're not here right now.
Right.
Maurice.
And I was going to show you, I have your book in my office in my house, and I forgot to bring it over. So I didn't start to read it yet, but I was one of the early purchasers.
It's a good read. I've got a copy. Actually, I should have had one here to hold it up in here. I've actually got a copy. I'm sure Menno's. You must have a copy there, Menno.
Actually, I don't.
Right, you two are going to have to forgive me for 1 second.
Sure.
There are a few things more valuable than space in my backpacks. So.
Hey, I just got an email today from the Journal of Human Kinetics, where we submitted the diet break study. It looks like it's accepted. And they're asking for us to send in our final draft. So I think we're done, other than whatever the delay. Hey, do you guys like this better or that light behind me? What's better?
I think you look good in any light, Bill.
But you're the only one.
Well, that's.
I'm going to change one more light.
Yeah, no, I think that works. I quite like the little sort of decor going on around above your head. It's like a sort of chintzy halo. Oh, I must have upset him. I wasn't joking. I really do think you look great in every light. Oh, there he is. So you guys have been pretty busy, huh?
As always.
Yeah. But so basically what I'll do is obviously I'm going to edit this down. I was going to try and go live, but then I thought my tech proficiency doesn't quite extend that far. So what I've got a load of points, but obviously some of those will cross over. And as Menno quite rightly pointed out, it's probably quite an ambitious. I love the fact that a Dutchman used the phrase "a tad ambitious." That's as English as it gets. That's probably our emails going backwards and forwards or something. But yeah, so basically what we'll do is we'll sort of motor through. I'm going to do some edits and then I'm going to use this as a bit of for some outtakes as well as the whole thing. So obviously I'm very excited to have both Bill Campbell and Menno Henselmans on the same call. Spoken to you both individually, interacted quite a lot over the years, and you know, to have both of you, I think I liken this to if someone's into sort of tech and space and getting the opportunity to sit down with Elon Musk and sort of Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates or something, like this is my moment right here. So yeah, thanks ever so much. And you know, obviously what with Menno's globe trotting and stuff, it's you know, it's quite difficult to get a time zone nailed down. So what I'm going to do is I want to focus this more on generic populations as opposed to the elite or the higher end of the training market. But obviously there's a lot of crossover. So what I'm going to do is if we can just get an introduction, flip a coin. Menno, go first. Tell us who you are and a bit about yourself for those that may not be aware.
Sure. So my name is Menno Henselmans. I do online coaching. I teach others how to do online coaching and physical coaching. I recently published a book, and just like Bill, I do some scientific research, but Bill's more into it full time, and I do it more as a labor of love on the side because, yeah, my main business is teaching other people how to become certified personal trainers.
Okay, Cool. And as I say, yeah, the book, we'll maybe touch on that, but I'll do a separate recommendation. We had a chat about it, and I've got a few other, quite a lot of information on that. Bill Campbell, speak now or forever hold your peace.
All right. Bill Campbell, I'm a professor of exercise science at the University of South Florida, which is in Tampa, Florida. And my research is focused on fat loss and a little bit more in the dieting sphere, so the weight loss realm, but I don't really study obesity. I study people that are somewhat fit or they're not overweight and they just want to get a little bit leaner. And I primarily focus on females, at least in the last few years. More of my attention has been on female fat loss in those who are already fit.
Okay, so basically trying to find the nth degree and optimize the sort of the ratios of fat loss, muscle gain, etc. So obviously you've got a book out as well, Bill. Give us a quick plug on the book.
Yeah, so it's a digital ebook, or it's basically all of my philosophies on fat loss for the type of person that I just suggested. Somebody who's what many people would call general population, but a little bit more serious.
Yeah.
So it's basically all in one space. It's just what's the research that I've used to rely on to come to my interpretations of how one should go on a fat loss phase or a muscle building phase. So there's two main sections. First half of the book is all nutrition, mostly dieting. And then the second half of the book is all resistance training. And the assumption is that you want to build muscle or maintain as much muscle when dieting as possible. And that's my first non-academic textbook. Everything else I've written has been like academic. So it was fun to be able to, have some scientific references, but not make it an academic writing. So it was new for me, and I enjoyed the process.
Mm-hmm. Trust the process, as we all say. What I'll make sure there's links to everything in and around where this goes out so that people can access it all. And your recent study, Bill, a bit of detail on that, because I think the last time we spoke, it was around April or May, and I think you'd literally just finished it. And did I just catch the tail end of you saying to Menno that it's, because I think you submitted it and you've just had some feedback that it's been accepted?
Yeah, and just to clarify, I've had two studies that we finished in the last year. One was a rapid fat loss study. The other one was a diet break study in resistance trained females. Are you referring to the diet break study?
I think the first one was resistance trained females. Had you finished that one around about May?
Yeah, I think that's right. No, we finished our rapid fat loss study was last May, and I think we finished the diet break study even before that. I actually had to take a hiatus from working on it. So I'll just briefly mention both. So neither of them are published yet. The diet break study was in resistance trained females. Menno and one of his colleagues helped us design the study, and his organization actually gave us funding for the study. Just got the email today that it has been accepted for publication. And that's always a special day. You always get a smile when you get that email.
It's like a half the press.
Yes, yeah. So sometime this year that should actually be published.
Amazing. And obviously, in terms of the research that goes through the university, how much of that is obviously Menno is in the space, he's operating in the space on a number of different levels. But I would assume that there's a lot of interested parties with research, and it's probably quite interesting trying to separate who's looking to have and support research for the right reasons. Do you get much sort of skullduggerous goings on with people trying to make things appear a certain way? I'm not suggesting that Menno is for 1 second. I'm going to get you both on the protein grams per kilogram argument. We're going to put the gloves on in a minute.
Yeah, I would say funding it's difficult. There's a lot more funding in my world in dietary supplements, and I used to do more of that. And one thing is just as, and this might be too detailed, but my lab will always own the data, or my university will always own the data. So that scares off a lot of supplement companies, because if the results don't come out the way they want, then they don't want it to be published. So, but usually universities will own the data. That's almost always a prerequisite. So you have generally good faith that a university funded study will publish the results even if they're not favorable. But more to my research on physique enhancement, there's really no funding, because there's a lot of funding in obesity research, but in terms of just, let's give money so that lean people can lose more fat. It's just not a public policy priority. So there are some like, so people like Menno, who has an appreciation for that, there's basically no funding for what I do. So that's why all of my students are volunteers. They don't get paid. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, sure. One thing I want to ask while it springs to mind, would you both be up for a study, almost like an online study, that's where people are through, obviously it's quite easy to go quite wide and design a study based on whether it's protein intakes, training volume, a combination of those things. Obviously it's not going to be to the same degree as a lab study where you're controlling every single variable and everything. Do you think there'd be any merit for doing some kind of study where you have people, maybe some qualifying rationale to say, if you are X amount of experience at this level of body fat, able to commit to training this number of times a week and follow these different types of diet? Would that be so? Because I'm not aware of anything that's been done that's similar to that, and I think that'd be massively interesting and probably.
You mean like a survey?
Huh?
You mean like a survey, or like actually telling them to do a specific program?
Yeah, I think, let's say for argument's sake, at the moment there's should it be 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight or 2.2? Should you do 10 to 12 sets per week, or should you do 20, or should you do 4? And have set up some different groups that are all trying different combinations and variables, just to see what the outcomes are that, from a big populace, because obviously you can go global, you can have you can define your criteria, you're not limited by geography. And also I think with the following, certainly with the two of you have, and there's obviously a few other sort of key suspects, as it were, in the space, that if they were part of something, I think that would draw massive interest, but also more importantly, that would get the interest of people that aren't necessarily already in the space, and optimizing, every gram of protein and every rep of every set, because it opens it up to maybe even to newcomers that say, do you know what, if you want to be part of a fun study and learn about principles of exercise science and body composition, I'd love to do some legwork on something like that, just to sort of put it together, because I think there'd be a lot of interest. I mean, what are your thoughts? Would that be achievable? Would it be possible?
Well,
We shall go first.
Yeah, I love the idea. Because the reason I love, and I'm going to say some areas where it would concern me. The reason I love the idea, because it would do exactly what you suggested. I think it would bring people into the research or scientific world that aren't currently there. So I think it would serve to educate a lot of the people who would follow that, and then they would learn, oh, you have to make this decision, and then they understand why decisions are made.
Yeah.
So I love the idea from just building a love and an appreciation for the research process or evidence-based fitness. And then some concerns, you said like 1.8 versus 2.2 grams per kg. Let's just say we did that with protein or training. I struggle with that, because my research has typically done very, very big differences between the two groups, because what could happen, 1.8 could be 2.0 if they are a little high. The 2.2 could be a little lower. Now you have no study, you have no comparison. So that would be the one thing I believe, at least in the early stages, 1.8 versus 3.2, if you can, if you could do such a thing. The only other concern, and I think this is what stopped me so far. Now I'm really focused on body composition.
Sure.
If the outcomes were maximal strength, I would have a lot more enthusiasm, but I just don't know how to standardize a body composition measurement virtually. I have not found a home-based scale yet that I feel that I would have any confidence in, and I'm trying. Could everybody go to a DEXA and get a DEXA? So that would be my biggest concern. How do I standardize that?
Okay, so I mean, without going too far down the rabbit hole with this one, I mean, there's quite a lot of standardized types of scale. I think you mentioned a type of scale in your last study, but then you said that it wasn't accurate enough for purpose. But I've used Withings quite a lot, and I've found them very consistent. That doesn't necessarily mean they're accurate, but if the same person steps on the same scales at the same time every day, you're going to get a much better result than going into your health club and doing a body smart scan and going somewhere else and doing, so I think it would be a prerequisite would be that people would need to actually have a set of smart scales and that would be part of the criteria. It would be, well, this measurement was taken on a Withings, this on a Body Smart, this on a InScan, whatever the different types are. But Menno, you sound like you're either about to piss on my chips or get me all excited.
Probably don't eat your chips.
Okay. Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm going to die.
There are logistical problems with it. I think adherence. We want to, most of the studies I've done, we assign people, even if it's digitally, so that ideally one person has a max of, say, 4 people that they're essentially coaching and they're supervising and they're checking in every day, like, eat your damn protein, your calories are too high. You have to taper it down a bit because it's so important. Because like Bill said, if you have two study groups and they're not doing what you want them to do, they also vary on other dimensions, then yeah, you have no study. That becomes very difficult. And then the body composition measurements, that would also be a big one. But even strength, because 1RM strength is I guess doable, but then people don't know how to do a 1RM, or they're not comfortable with the bench press or squat.
Well, I think if you without this becoming a plug for my new app and platform, which it's definitely not, and that's not where I'm going. Well, maybe a little bit, but if there was a means, and this isn't contrived, I'm actually feeling like I sound contrived, and I know I'm not. So, but if the exercise format was standardized, for example, I always use a rest pause at the end of every rep, and certain techniques, tempos. And I get coaching videos uploaded to, did I mention my new platform? So that my new platform would actually be able to standardize it. I've got the MFP database, the original, the database that MFP uses, which is the largest one in the world, the global one. That's a part of my app and platform. And all of it could be put through with uploads to videos and links and live streams and everything else. So I know that it's not going to be nearly the same as, getting Bill in his white coat, walking around the lab with his clipboard, checking what everyone's eating and how everyone's going. But bearing in mind that the key purpose is education, I feel that people are still going to be learning about stuff. I understand that scientifically the data might not be as 100% as accurate as we'd like. But we'll chew on that. I just wanted to sort of put that out there.
I think actually there's probably the most prospect for something that aims for high ecological validity and has subjective measures as outcomes. Okay. For example, maybe you could do a study like this on diet adherence, because then the adherence itself is what you're interested in.
I like that.
So you could check how people, how frequently they weigh their food, how often they check in, how they report that they're doing. And that in itself might be what we are interested in.
Do you know what? And
yeah, so you can do that with, say, different protein intakes and then see if it
it's
makes it
almost
easier.
The body composition changes are almost a side effect, like a secondary effect to adherence. I mean, I've always said that aesthetics is a side effect of athletics, but you know, if you're looking to see how people adhere, whether it's certain calorie deficits and stuff. I'll tell you what I want to do. I want to move through our list because I'm very aware that time will be ticking, and we'll cover a lot of these topics. So one of the things I quote, Menno, is when new clients come to me and they're trying to understand what is evidence-based, you know, my fairly standard go-to is I say to them, well, okay, I can tell you how much protein to eat, and you'll say, yeah, but what does 30 grams of protein in the form of cooked chicken breast look like? Well, it's this much. But if you want to understand how we arrive at these numbers, read this meta-analysis, then read the debate between you and Eric Helms, on which for me is still one of my, I mean, it's one of my favorite bits of reading. But just talk a little bit about that meta-analysis so that people that are referencing can hear it, you know, from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Sure, yeah. I co-authored I think still latest meta-analysis, I'm quite sure, sort of the optimal protein intake for muscle growth. And we found quite robust evidence consistent with the I think still every nutrient timing controlled, randomized controlled trial that compared different protein intakes, that there were no benefits above 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. So more protein is better up until that point. That's called a break point in the analysis. And that's basically when the gains taper off. You've satiated the body's requirements for protein in terms of muscle protein synthesis. And thereafter, you could still eat more protein, but it won't make you bigger, not more than, you know, consuming carbs.
And then obviously I think it was probably the most courteous argument between two people on opposing points I've ever seen, with you and Eric almost apologizing for disagreeing with each other. But obviously Eric came in higher at, I think, 2.2, was it 2.2 he was suggesting was ideal?
Right, so if Eric, we specifically debated if protein requirements, well, we also touched on general protein requirements, but we mainly debated whether protein requirements increase in energy deficit as opposed to when bulking in energy surplus or at energy maintenance.
Okay. And Bill, I know that a lot of your studies have centered around exactly that, haven't they? Sort of calorie deficits, maintaining protein. And because I think you sit at the sort of 2 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, don't you?
Yeah, so that is my general recommendation. The way that I articulate my point of view is the consensus in our field is that 1.6 grams per kg is the amount where you maximize adaptations to resistance training. So that's the point at which when you eat more than that, you likely you shouldn't expect to gain more muscle mass.
Yeah.
And almost all of those studies have been done in males, so it's a male biased number. I will tell people to aim for 2.2 grams per kg, and I'll share the evidence that I rely on for that, as well as the other part of it, which is just practical. So in United States, we obviously go by pounds, and a gram per pound is very easy for people to conceptualize. So if they weigh 140 pounds, get 140 grams of protein. So there's practical element to that recommendation. In terms of why, so again, I'll usually state, hey, the evidence would suggest, or the consensus suggests that muscle mass gains are kind of capped at 1.6 grams per kg, but 2.2 grams per kg, there's no harm. So I want to start there. We don't have any adverse health outcomes. And we'd also have, I'm aware of about 3 studies where in people who are resistance training and they increase their protein only in the form of protein, so calories go up, they do not gain fat, and in some cases, again, I'm talking about a handful of studies, they've actually lost body fat. So there's one some of the evidence that I'm relying on that where more may be better. Another line of evidence that I rely on, there's only been 2, maybe 3 protein titration studies that were acute in nature, where they gave people, let's say, 10, 20, 30, 40 grams per dose, and they looked at muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah.
And what both of those studies reported was, once you went above 20 or 30 grams, so let's say 40 grams, and this is one sitting, so we're not looking at total daily, but obviously they're related. They both reported no significant difference with higher per dose, per protein feeding meal on muscle protein synthesis. Mm-hmm. But there was still an increase in muscle protein synthesis. It just didn't reach the level of statistical significance. So I look at that, and I believe both of those were in resistance trained males. It looks like you kind of get this sigmoid shape on a per feeding basis, where more and more protein has less and less of an effect, but there is still a small effect. And where I think that practically might be beneficial is in highly resistance trained people, people who carry a lot of muscle mass. Think of like a male bodybuilder. Yeah. So again, the biggest impact will be up to 1.6 grams per kg per day, and relying on these acute muscle protein synthesis studies. Maybe more protein has just less and less of a benefit the more and more you get. And then finally, the other evidence is, we did a study, we published this study in 2018 comparing, it ended up being 2.5 versus 0.9 grams per kg. And these were in resistance trained females. The 2.5 was significantly better for gains in lean body mass than the low protein group. That's not surprising. But that study really doesn't say, well, maybe 1.6 would have done just as much. And we don't know, it could have. But the data that I have from that study is the average protein intake in that group, in the high protein group, they came into the study averaging 1.5 grams per kg. And every subject increased protein, again, on average to 2.5. And most of the subjects in that group did gain lean body mass.
What was the length of that study?
What's that?
What was the length of the study?
Oh, that was 8 weeks. Right. 8 weeks. And a clear limitation of that study was we did not measure total body water. I didn't have the ability to test body water. So I can't say that was all fat-free mass, or, that wasn't all protein contractile tissue. Yeah. Could have been body water. I don't think that was the case, but that was a major limitation of my lab at that time. And then I'll just throw one other thing that's not scientific at all, but it does influence my thinking. This is more with females. The females that I come, the leanest females, and this is throughout my career, and this is where I have a bias. I do have a bias towards higher protein, but we actually just completed data collection on another study where I'm trying to challenge my bias. Just in general, very lean females, almost across the board, their protein intakes just seem to be very high. That's just where they gravitate. So some of them very practical, some of them anecdotal, some of them from data from my own study, which is in a handful of subjects, and some of what's informed me of my opinion is from these acute muscle protein synthesis studies. And then finally, not just looking at fat-free mass, but also total body composition. What also happens to fat mass? So that's what has led me to and up to 2.2 grams per kg.
I suppose a bit of the difference between males and females, off the top of my head, is that males are going to be largely focusing on muscle gain, whereas females are going to be largely focusing on fat loss. Would that be a reasonable assumption in terms of how they choose to set up their diet and the assumptions they're making setting up their diet?
Yeah, I choose to not equate those two populations. If somebody's dieting, I would say that's not a fair comparison to a non-dieting situation. So sure. Personally, I have opinions from both, but at this point in our conversation, I'm relying on studies where there was no caloric deficit.
Yeah, it's actually interesting, the protein requirements for women, because we have one meta-analysis on untrained, as in sedentary women, I think, that found that women's protein requirements, I think expressed in gram per kilogram body weight, are like 10% lower, 11% if I recall correctly. Wasn't a statistically significant difference. However, most research assumes protein needs scale with body weight, and that assumption is actually
Lean body
not
mass.
really.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. Should we use lean body mass? But there's actually very little research directly showing that protein requirements indeed scale with body weight or lean body mass. And the only somewhat direct study on this looked at per meal protein requirements, like how much protein you eat per dose to maximize muscle protein synthesis. And they found no difference between two groups, both men, I think, with a substantial difference in lean body mass, like 20 kilograms or something. So that would suggest that protein needs are actually more sort of set around a certain level for a person, regardless of body weight. And that would mean that women might not actually have enough protein when they consume, say, 1.6, especially if they're lighter. Because even though then we think, well, their protein needs are only like, say, they're 50 kilograms, 50 times 1.6, that's not even 100. And in actuality, it might be that, you know, most women's protein requirements, strength training women's, is like 100 grams. So I typically actually use a lower limit of about 100 for women. If it goes lower than that, and I typically use 1.8 gram per kilogram, but if that number is below 100, I'll still say, well, probably 100 plus.
Yeah. Because, I mean, is it possible that obviously if there's a noted 10% difference in the protein requirement, couldn't that be attributed to the difference in body composition? There's a natural difference as an average of about 10% in terms of lean body mass and fat mass with men and women, isn't there? Approximately.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, it's both are about 10%. Yeah.
Yeah. So it'd certainly be the first area if Bill lets me borrow his white coat for a little while, it'd be the first area I'd be trying to sort of look at to see if there was anything there. And in terms of, let's come back to with these sort of diets, body composition, and the importance of resistance training, because I think a lot of people, have you guys noticed just generally, everyone is waking up now to this high protein for fat loss, whereas going back a short period of time, it was the domain of the bodybuilder. You know, protein drinks were for, you know, protein chugging bodybuilders and no one else. Whereas now, I think everyone's sort of getting into the fact that obviously, you know, high protein is great for body composition.
I think that's great. I think that's completely warranted, even for people that don't train. I think the consensus at this point is 1.2 gram per kilogram per day for satiety and health benefits.
Yeah.
So I think 1.8, 0.8 is still the RDA
recommended
in America.
0.75 here and 0.8 over there, I think.
Yeah, so that's a fair bit lower than what I think consensus statement on protein experts is, even for sedentary individuals. So I think it's great that there's more attention to high protein diets. It's also one of the few things we know really works, you know, in the diet wars.
Yeah.
Like high carb, low carb, paleo, when you do Atkins, Ornish. And one of the only things that really consistently does work on almost every parameter.
Yeah, if your
high
calories
protein.
and protein are right, then every diet works. And if they're wrong, no diet works. It's just the
right.
In terms of sort of looking at fat loss, obviously there's two things. I'm very anti the typical body transformation industry. I don't think it's healthy. I've done a bit of work with the Eating Disorders Association. I've worked with quite a few athletes that have, you know, had some real sort of disordered eating habits triggered. What would you say is an optimal, I won't say maximal fat loss or weight loss, but an optimal weight loss that becomes sustainable for beyond the typical, I mean, I run an 8 or 12 week program typically, but obviously what you're trying to do is coach and educate people how to manage their diet and exercise regime for the rest of their life. Not, you know, I think one of the things I laugh about is Slimming World. People go back to it every year because it's so good. well, if it was so good, you wouldn't need to keep going back to it every year. But what would you think? I mean, Bill, have you seen anything in terms of, you know, that beyond a certain threshold, there's an increased likelihood of gaining it back or non-adherence?
So I have not spent, I don't know the literature well enough to comment, at least as an expert, on weight regain after time. All of my research has been on fat loss with caloric deficits and resistance training. But yeah, so I don't want to comment on the likelihood of it getting back. I mean, I'll just say, I'll use myself as an example. I always gain fat back over time.
For research purposes, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny. Yeah, I love doing experiments on myself.
Yeah.
So it's not a big deal because I always learn, and it's funny. A lot of times I'll generate research ideas just from my own experiences.
Yeah.
But my focus is on, again, a non-obese population. So I'm not gonna. This would pertain to people who are, you know, already somewhat fit. My interpretation of this literature would suggest that about 1% of current body weight per week. So losing 1% of your body weight per week is very optimal for losing body fat and maintaining muscle mass, assuming you're resistance training and having a relatively high protein intake. And again, this whole research literature, we're talking less than 10 studies that I'm aware of that have looked at dieting situations in a non-obese population with people that are exercising. And when you go above this 1% per week of total body weight loss, that's where you start to see the composition coming more from a fat-free mass compartment and less from the total body fat. When the percentage is 1% or less, nearly all of the weight loss is coming from the body fat compartment.
Yeah. Menno, obviously you're working with a lot of pre-contest contest prep athletes and sort of fitness models and that sort of thing. Do you find there's a sweet spot in terms of if the fat or weight loss is too aggressive, adherence becomes more of an issue?
Definitely. I mean, I'd say overall, the higher the deficit, the greater the challenges to diet adherence. But in terms of sustainability, that needn't be a problem necessarily. I would say that the biggest, like, overall interpretation of literature, I'd say that diet adherence, the likelihood of weight regain is greater if the diet people used deviated more from what they can sustainably eat, or what their default is in their mind.
Yeah.
So if you get people and they're eating a certain way, and you tell them to do a snake diet water fast, or you give them meal replacement products. Right. So you give them meal replacement products or whatever, and you just tell them, okay, this is what you're going to do now for, say, a month. Then that can actually work really well. Meal replacement products, there's also a meta-analysis showing this, are really effective in a short term.
I've got to plug them because they're very good to me.
Right. But they do nothing to teach people how to diet.
Yeah.
If you just give people food and just tell people, okay, this is what you're going to eat the coming periods, then all they've learned is I eat this instead of real food.
That's why I hate meal plans on a coaching program. You know, teach people how to eat, not what to eat.
Right. It works better if they make it themselves, at least in the long run.
Yeah. And I think that's where, you know, trying to go through it's the education thing, because ultimately, I mean, I've always said, I've got some people that have been with me 20 and in a couple of cases 30 years, but they're not training with me every week. They'll come back to me because they've got a new challenge, or they're going skiing, they want to get fit, or they want to run a marathon, or, you know, and these people have been with me a long time. But I've always said, if someone needs to speak to me for their own health and fitness reasons after 3 months, then I haven't done my job properly. And I think so many people now, they're sort of PTs, I mean, you're involved with a lot of them, but, you know, through being an employer and working with big organizations in the UK, you know, it's all about selling sessions as opposed to selling results. And I think that's, you know, we need to get away from this. Oh, how many sessions can I book next week? Do 2 sessions, and you want to keep those clients on for as long as possible. It should be much more about education. And I think the importance of setting a diet up around someone's pre-existing preferences and choices is, you know, I just see so much more adherence and sustainability. And you speak to them 6 months later, and they may have fallen off or not have been as tight, but there's a certain amount of change that will stick because they haven't been told to completely change, you know, the way they're eating and what they're doing. So when we are, where are we? So when you're setting up, and obviously I've been a client, how I first met you, Menno, was as an online client. But when you're setting up a diet, obviously I know your questionnaire, your pre-coaching questionnaire very well. But obviously taking into account the motivation, and obviously I think there's some great things. Did I mention Menno's book about sort of willpower and motivation that comes into play? Because obviously if you rely on those, you're almost setting yourself up for failure, because the weekend will come, that glass of wine will come, the inhibitions will get kicked into touch. So how important is it to set the whole regime up around, as far as possible, people's existing habits and preferences?
I think a lot. Most research finds, interestingly, that actual self-control ability does not correlate very well with success in terms of productivity and diet adherence, but rather avoidance of reliance on self-control is what determines success. So, and people that have more self-control actually also are generally better at avoiding reliance on self-control. And how do you avoid reliance on self-control? By having habits, because as soon as something is habitual, it requires no more conscious thought. If it requires no conscious thought, no decision making, you can make a bad decision, because that's what self-control often is. It's making the right decision. Often you know what the right decision is, but you still succumb for the tempting pizza, or the microwave meal, ordering food, whatever's more convenient or tempting.
Yeah.
So I think establishing successful dietary habits and routines is super, super important, especially in the long run for diet success.
So I'd like to run it. I mean, I've got a theory. I have lots of theories, but I honestly believe, because the body evolved to survive both as an organism and for the benefit of the species. I think if you're in a calorie deficit, the body doesn't think, oh, losing weight or looking good in a pair of jeans or budgie smugglers. It's thinking, oh, food scarcity. How long am I going to survive given my current energy expenditure and my current availability of food? And when you're forcing the body to make a choice under those circumstances, do I grab the pizza? Do I have the healthy meal? If it's faster, the body's going to say, give me the calories, give me what's going to help me live longer, as opposed to give me what's going to help me look good in a photo shoot next week. And I think a lot of people, they think this is true. And I think a lot of people don't sort of, they don't understand that there are so many counterintuitive things with the difference between aesthetics and athletics. And, we didn't evolve by looking at mirrors, didn't exist when we started evolving. So what would be if you were setting up a program from a training and nutrition point of view, what would be the key things that you would be looking at as a motivator with a client when you're setting up that program and trying to gauge how far to push them or how hard to push them in the gym, etc.?
Do you mean gauging how motivated they are?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, because I know a lot of people, they say, yeah, I'm going to give this everything. Well, everything is a relative term, right? Mm-hmm. But how do you gauge what their incentives and motivations are and how you prescribe against that?
Well, one thing that's really important is to learn to distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So you can divide goals into extrinsic and extrinsic, meaning that intrinsic motivation comes from within. There's just a certain drive. You don't really know why you're doing something. You just feel like you're compelled to look better or achieve certain things, but not in the sense of having a 300-pound bench press or 10% body fat. Those are called performance goals. Mm-hmm. And they are often more extrinsic, or I need to look good for this holiday because I'll be on the beach a lot, and after that I don't care anymore. Or I'm dieting for my wedding, or I'm in this 6-week transformation challenge. These are relatively empty types of motivation.
Yeah.
So intrinsic motivation, in all research and definitely all my experience, is far, far stronger and far longer lasting. So you want to cultivate that and look for those signs and foster those, and steer away from extrinsic motivators, even tangibly, because there's something called an over-justification effect, where you add extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation, it can actually take over the intrinsic motivation because people sort of forget why they're doing it. For example, if someone's naturally motivated to get healthier, and then you tell them, well, if you reach 15% body fat by May 20th, I'm going to give you $10,000, or worse, let's say $100. And then it becomes really hard to diet. And then what sort of goes on in people's mind is, well, I'm doing this for these $100. I don't really need $100. And I think I would much rather just enjoy the coming weeks. And they sort of, it sort of takes over the internal process that came before it, which was just, I want to be healthier and leaner. So you have to be really careful with extrinsic motivators.
And in terms of, just to double back on something, protein and protein types, we're sort of just back on track because I missed the point. Obviously, protein, not all protein is created equal, and we've got either animal proteins, plant-based proteins, then we've got combinations of different proteins. Bill, I know you're a fan of casein, aren't you, in the evening before you go to bed?
Well,
it's a personal thing.
No, the way that I look at protein is I would structure the most important thing is your total daily amount.
Yeah.
Then the second is to distribute that approximately evenly throughout the day.
Yeah.
One thing that I like about casein for myself is it makes me feel fuller.
Yeah.
But in terms of taking it before bed at night, there is some research to suggest that because it's slower digesting, that the muscle protein synthetic response is elongated.
Mm-hmm.
And that is true when it's compared to whey protein.
Yeah.
Whey protein typically will give you a little bit more of a higher muscle protein synthesis response in the first 3 hours. Casein will give you a little bit higher muscle protein synthesis response from hours 3 to 6.
Yeah.
But when they compare them both at the end of 6 hours, they're the same. So I don't, I'm not against casein before bed, but I think as long as your total daily protein intake is adequate, it's not giving you any unique advantage.
And in terms of protein types, Menno, I mean, obviously, whether it's animal protein, meats, eggs, etc., how would you've got a total amount of protein, how would you optimally prescribe, making up the protein in a diet? Would you have a certain amount of different types, or doesn't really matter? Obviously, given the amino acid profile.
Most protein requirements are based on the implicit assumption, often it's not even stated anymore, and it's quite hard to find, that about 50% of the protein intake comes from high quality sources, which basically means animal sources.
Yeah.
Poultry, fish, meat, dairy, eggs. Because plant protein sources are of lower quality.
Yeah.
Pretty much any type of protein quality index you look at. I think DIAS is currently the gold standard. And you typically find that there's a substantial difference in protein quality. Now, there have been a few studies challenging how relevant this is, but I think overall, you want to add some protein if you're relying on plant protein sources.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of, I think the Huel that you mentioned also has that. About 80% pea protein, 20% rice protein.
It's a blend, isn't it?
Actually,
it complements the essential amino acids are complemented in both. And I think, in fact, when I first started training with you a few years ago, I was on Huel, and I think your first comment was I should consider the protein to calories ratio was too low. And I was actually talking to James Collier, who's one of the founders of Huel. And And I just said, oh yeah, I was using Huel. And what I used to do was add a couple of scoops of either whey isolate or vegan protein. But then I went completely plant-based for a period. And they brought out Huel Black, which is a bit of a plug because, as I say, I think they're a great company and their ethics are sound. But they've got their hot and savory range now as well. I don't know if have you come across Huel, Bill?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
It's basically, it's a vegan sort of protein stroke food supplement company. But I find it makes getting the right food. It's basically a very healthy. It's like a high performance pot noodle. I mean, James may not be being compared to a pot noodle, but it's literally you pour it in exactly the same pot and stir it up, and the macros is 400 calories, 26 grams of protein. It's a good quality protein, but it's a plant-based protein. And typically I'll have a couple of boiled eggs with the meal. So that takes it up to about 550, 600 calories for about 40 grams. But then I've obviously improved the quality of the protein by putting some eggs with it. And in terms of sort of red meat, chicken, fish, any preferences or just a balance of all of them?
They're pretty similar on almost all scales. And the few studies that have directly compared different food sources, or that have compared beef protein, egg protein with dairy proteins, or as Bill said, whey and casein, even different dairy, they find it's pretty similar. If you start processing it more, it becomes a bit worse in some research.
Yeah.
But just the whole protein sources themselves are probably trivially different.
So
except, by the way, raw eggs.
With whey, it was a waste product of cheese manufacturers, the bit they threw away. Well, hey, but now it's almost as if that's the good bit. It's like the tail started wagging the dog all of a sudden, because certainly in terms of health and everything else, and a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, I look at whey as a food rather than as a supplement. Because if you look at it, it's no different. Is it a fillet steak or is it a sirloin or is it a ribeye? It's just a different cut of the same animal. And almost with whey, and then obviously you get your concentrates, isolates, and casein. I think the biggest advantage of the more purified or filtrated proteins is obviously there tends to be a lot less lactose, because you don't suffer with that. But I know even if I have a whey concentrate, I really notice like some unnecessary rumblings, and I certainly wouldn't want to be going on a heavy squats or deadlift day within too soon after. I think a lot of people you speak to aren't even aware, and I've had people eliminate it from their diet and go to an isolate, and they're like, "Oh my god, I didn't even realise. I thought it was something else. I thought it was something." Do you find that with any of your athletes or people sort of commenting on sort of bowels or gastrointestinal issues with?
Yeah, the majority of the world is lactose intolerant.
Yeah,
which is a fact that goes unnoticed by most of us Northwest Europeans, because lactose tolerance rates here are like 98%. So if you tell someone you're lactose intolerant in Norway or the Netherlands, it's a bit like gluten intolerance, where they're sort of not sure if that's a real thing.
right. Yeah.
Whereas if you say someone is lactose intolerant here in Brazil or in Taiwan, then they're like, yeah, of course, who isn't?
Yeah. And Bill, when you do your studies at the gym, do you oversee training prescription on that at all? Or is it they just assume to be training and you're only manipulating the protein intake or calorie intake?
No, there's always a training prescription. Now, one thing that we will start doing that we didn't used to do, and this is kind of something I think that the profession needs to do, is to prescribe their resistance training program based on what they've been doing in terms of volume and ideally intensity. Mm-hmm. So yeah, my lab will never do another study where everybody does the same program. So we would know what they're doing coming in, and then we would base their program on that. So it's still the same for everybody, but it's the same based on their current volume or their current workload.
Presumably to rule out any enhanced or adaptation to the change in training protocol.
Yeah, it's Yeah, and I'll just say it's silly. And again, I did this myself. When you do these resistance training studies, and let's say it's a volume study, and one group you're going to say is going to do 20 sets per week per body part, another group's going to do 10, and another group 5. Well, some people are increasing their volume in the high group, some are decreasing their volume in the high volume group. So you're not really studying what you want to study. Now, I think, and Menno might have his pulse on this a little better than I do, I think things are changing, and I think that's where the profession needs to go, or where that research needs to go when we're looking at resistance training studies, especially if it's volume related.
Menno, thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's definitely a new area. It's very interesting. I think one study from the last 2018, 19 really changed people's thinking on this, and it found that both groups doing about 20 sets per muscle group per week, but the group doing a 20% increase from their previous volume, which so happens to be about 20 sets per week average, did better than the group doing is simply a fixed 20 sets per week. Not sure of the exact numbers, but that was the principle. And that led to the idea that it's where you come from, not the volume that you're going to, basically. I'm not fully convinced by that idea, but I think it is one of the more interesting things we should study to see if that really is a thing. Because if we assume that most people that are resistance trained have some idea of what their optimal volume is, and I think we can also relatively safely assume that most people are more likely to be under than over their optimal volume. Based on those two premises, we would expect indeed that a mild increase in training volume for most people is beneficial. So you're going to get a pretty positive, homogeneous response.
Yeah.
As opposed to if you just set it at a fixed 20, that might mean that some people actually were doing more than that, and so they decreased it, and it's unlikely they're going to profit from that. So that means you get a more homogeneous response, but not necessarily on average better response if you increase it from before as opposed to setting a fixed number. But that is interesting. So I'm not fully convinced it really is the fact that it was an increase, or if it's just the fact that, well, people are at a certain volume, and it's because of these premises that if you increase it from that point, you're typically getting more average positive results than if you set it at a flat number. Not necessarily the fact that they increased it, because if you increase it by, say, 100%, it might become equally detrimental, equally excessive compared to doing that same volume at a fixed level. I think we need more studies on this because it's mostly based on one study so far.
Because also I think in terms of what that volume consists of, I mean, the whole thing is greater than the sum of its parts. Because I mean, I think there was a post, what was it, about training to failure and the necessity to train to failure, and there's people are sort of moving away from it now. And I've always, my standard protocol involves an AMRAP, and which is last set is to failure. But then obviously there's 3 different types of failure. I mean, I'm very strict. There's a pause at the end. Every single, phase of the rep, of every rep is controlled. Every weight, every load, every set is controlled. And I tend to use, I would say, a lot of people that start training with me in the first week or two, they're like, I'm not doing enough. And then in the second week or two, they're like, my numbers are moving up more quickly than they, well, yeah, because it's effective reps as opposed to, because obviously you've got technical failure, volitional failure, and then absolute sort of, muscle failure where you just can't get another rep out. And I think, what are your views on that with regards to failure? Because I think you sort of advocate a slightly higher volume, but staying a little bit lighter on the away from, or reps in reserve, or as ever you'd call it, don't you?
Right. I think AMRAP is generally fine. The most important thing with the avoidance of training to failure is avoiding actual true momentary muscle failure, especially in the earlier sets of a workout and for a muscle group, because they not only have a poor stimulus to fatigue ratio, but they also decrease your work capacity in the remaining sets. So it's great that you do now take a set to failure, which nets you, not even one full extra rep compared to an MRAP, because MRAP is, well, you get the full 10 reps, and then failure means, well, you fail the 11th. So you get, say, half an extra rep, and that costs a lot of fatigue, and that half a rep might cost you 3 reps across the next couple sets because you're more fatigued now. So you actually end up with a lower total volume, and we see that in a few studies where people, ironically, training with higher effort come out with lower total volume. And the total volume is definitely more important than eking out or not even eking it out, failing that last repetition. So I think that therein really lies the crux. I think we shouldn't, especially more mainstream audience, you shouldn't tell them, don't train to failure, because then often they will train in reality very far from failure. Because as you said, momentary muscle failure, which is like gun to your head, there's no physical way you can produce the amount of force needed to lift this weight one more time, is very different from what's called volitional failure, which just means it got too hard, I give up. And for a lot of people, research finds that is actually a few reps difference, and sometimes like 10 reps. So that is a really big difference, right? That's like a warm-up set level for some people. Other people, that's their sort of max effort. So if you tell those people, don't train to failure, they're going to achieve nothing, because they're just going to be too scared to invest any effort.
Okay, well, that's all bar one of my subjects. Can I have one more minute of both of your time? I know that you're both sticklers, but and this last thing, I know that Bill's got a big history with supplements. You've represented and sat on boards of sort of supplement companies and stuff. If you only had, say, 3 or 4 supplements, and I'm not including whey or protein as a supplement here, what would you recommend?
Fish oils with high EPA, DHA. That would be one. Creatine would be a second. Multivitamin, just as an insurance policy. I think that exhausts my list right now. That's I'll stop there.
Based on the science. And I mean, caffeine, I'm just off 3 days off caffeine at the moment. I find getting off it, I think I'm going to start it again just because of the benefits I feel. It's like putting on a pair of shoes that are too small, just for the luxury of taking them off. Menno, views on supplements?
Yeah, creatine and the others are caffeine probably would make it to top 4, even though most of the effects psychological rather than really physical. At least at tolerable, sustainable dosages based on most research. And then the others are like supplements. I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but depending on someone's diet, I might recommend. And vitamin D would be high up on the list. Because very few people, like if you live in Florida, it's fine. But a lot of people don't get enough sun exposure. So then vitamin D supplementation can be beneficial for a lot of things. And then some other micros, magnesium deficiency is quite common, especially in athletes, on low carb diets. And then there's like, if you're a vegan or vegetarian, zinc is also quite likely to be beneficial.
B12 is, most things are enriched with B12 now anyway, aren't they? So
yeah, the B12 for vegans would be on there, but then I just recommend a vitamin B complex or a multi.
Okay. Gentlemen, fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate both your time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the full interview out, but I'm going to chop it up into some different bits. If you would be kind enough, just in an email, to find me links to where you have books, your PDF book, Bill, obviously, if there's a preferred purchase route for you, Menno, on yours, because I know you've got it up in some different places. And I'm going to link some different bits around where this does get posted. But yeah, I feel like a kid in a sweet shop. It's been really good to have you both on at the same time. I'm giving up. I'm retiring now. That's it. I can't really go anywhere from here. That's it. I'm over and out. Fantastic, gents. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I think there. Small hours for me, but absolute pleasure. Thank you, and I'll catch you again very soon.
All right. Thank you, Dan.
See you.
Cheers, gents. Thanks, guys.